You still awake? Did you get food and stuff at lunch? Yes? All right, so my name's Tiffany, and I am from Toronto. I came here on a very long flight, stopped in Frankfurt. And a little bit more about me, I'm also owner of this cute little puppy here named Walnut. You can follow him on Instagram. He has more followers than I do. And I work for a company called Shopify. I work at Shopify as a developer advocacy lead, which is essentially a fancy title for somebody who speaks, teaches, and writes all about front-end development for developers looking to build on our platform and looking to build specifically for Shopify. So I help build products for developers on a dev tools and education team as part of our platform. So what is Shopify? How many people have heard of Shopify before here? Okay, a little bit. That's better than most places outside, anyway. So Shopify is essentially an e-commerce platform that allows merchants to sell their goods and stuff online. You can also sell in person with a POS system or through a bunch of different channels like Amazon or Pinterest. And so Shopify acts as this like one sort of main source of truth for all of your business. Currently, there's over 800,000 merchants using Shopify in over 175 different countries. And that's obviously a lot of stores, which means the products that we build at Shopify need to be really flexible in order to suit different markets, different cultures, and businesses of all sizes. And at Shopify, we maintain a lot of code. We have over 3,000 repositories on GitHub as of last week when I checked this. And because we have so many different things going on, we need a way to manage those properties, right? And from a front-end perspective, we do this with design systems that we've created with components. So what's a design system? A lot of you guys are developers here, so I'm just going to tell you. Jeremy Key summed it up really well when he said, the generally accepted definition of a design system is that it's the outer circle. It encompasses both pattern libraries and style guides, which you guys are probably really familiar with, as well as any other artifacts, right? But there's something more. Just because you have a collection of design patterns doesn't mean that you have a design system. A system is a framework, right? It's a rule book. It's what tells you how those patterns work together. And so a system isn't effective unless those things are working together. And a design system can encompass and exist in a variety of forms and may include some, all, or just a few of these, right? It can contain different rule sets and patterns, philosophies on how the system should actually be used. But what matters most here is that there's a shared understanding at your organization and a shared vocabulary that you as an organization or what have you, understand what your design system consists of, how to use it, and how to actually maintain it. And so you might see a design system contain things from content and writing guidelines to voice and tone and brand identity, but also include patterns and components for building, say, for example, Rails apps, which is what I'm going to show you today, which is what Shopify's sort of stack is. We build all of our main products in Ruby on Rails. But you might also have code style guides, right, that actually show you and show other developers at your company what is the preferred way or method in how to code or write, say, for example, an array, or how to actually like format what the actual code style is that you prefer. And so what does Shopify's systems actually look like? What are the components, what are those components that we actually use? I'm going to show you guys today some stuff that like nobody outside of Shopify usually gets to see. So I'm going to show you some of our internal things, which is kind of cool. And hopefully I don't get in trouble because I haven't run this by anyone. But one of the things that I want to stress is one size doesn't fit all, right? I said earlier that we have over 3,000 repositories on GitHub, and obviously not all of those repositories are fully fledged Rails apps that are public-facing, but we have a lot of systems at Shopify that have helped us quickly scale. And some of those systems include a few different things. Specifically, part of our workflow, we have a bunch of different code style guides. So this is an example of our JavaScript code style guide that just lives in GitHub. And you can see just in the table of contents that we have specific rules around naming and white space, punctuation, preferences, control flows. And this style guide here actually helps inform our linting as well. So all of the linters that run on CI and that kind of thing follow these patterns, and so if those things are updated, then it's reflected here, and this is a really great way for us to onboard new people. We also have something called the Shopify marketing design system. This is completely internal. Nobody usually gets to see this except people who actually work for Shopify, and so you get to see it today. So it might not look as pretty as something public-facing, but it's still designed and it uses a lot of the components that we actually use for our properties, and I'll explain that a little bit more. And then finally, for those of you who might know Shopify already and have developed on Shopify in any capacity, you're probably aware of Polaris, which is our public-facing design system for building apps. So Shopify marketing design system and Polaris are our two main design systems that we use internally to build applications. And Polaris is actually shared with our third-party developers outside of Shopify as React components. So like I said, the marketing design system, which is used for all of our brochure sites and other public-facing properties, include like Shopify.com, anything facing our merchants or developers or enterprise clients. And it contains all of our brand guidelines and visual guidelines, things on voice and tone. But it also contains stuff about accessibility. So it contains guidelines for development. Specifically, all of our components come with detailed documentation that outlines expected screen reader and keyboard interactions, and specifically specific accessibility considerations such as Y area requirements, and it also includes an extensive component library that you can see here. So for new developers joining Shopify, this is, and if you're building and working on some of our marketing teams, this is what you're introduced to. And you'll be asked to sort of build a page. And you can go through these things and look at a design and ideally be able to build something relatively quickly, even if you've never used Rails before, even if you're not super confident with Ruby. And all of these things are designed in such a way that it helps people onboard and work faster and smarter. The second is Polaris. So like I mentioned before, this is Shopify's product design system. So we have an internal Rails implementation and components in Polaris, as well as public-facing version of this that contains React components. So Polaris is used for how we design and develop the Shopify admin. So what our merchants actually log into. You can think of it as like the content management system when they log in to like edit their website or update their products and their inventories. This is what we actually use to design that. And so it serves as a way for our third-party developers as well to build apps. What's great about this is it allows our third-party developers to think about and access that look, feel, and really have their apps work just like Shopify. We do this in order to improve our merchant experience, right? Our merchants get the benefit of like our app developers being able to use this system and employ these React components, and then it feels like the same experience for somebody who's actually building, or somebody who's actually both building, but then also for our merchants that are actually using our system. So Polaris contains content guidelines, voice and tone, as well, and things for colors, typography, illustrations, but it also contains, again, a huge pattern library of components with accessibility guidelines and best practices. And then we also tell people how to implement them, right? So you can go into also our mobile patterns, and you can see specific things that we have for Android and iOS. So both the Shopify marketing design system and the Polaris design system are consumed internally by many large-scale applications. They exist as Ruby gems, and then they contain shared components that can be extended to multiple projects. So Polaris React, like I said, is our open source public-facing design system, which you saw a little bit earlier, and that's the main website that I was scrolling through. And again, this was created for our third-party developers. It has about 60,000 downloads per week on NPM, and you can see internally we have about 62 Rails projects running marketing assets and about 32 running Polaris from Rails perspective. I mentioned in both our design systems, we have guidelines for accessibility. So I want to preface that accessibility is something we're still working on at Shopify. We are by no means perfect, but we continue to iterate and grow how accessible our applications are and our websites, and it's a process, right? Nobody is going to have, if anybody's ever, how many people have done accessibility work before? Okay, like 7. Cool. So hopefully you'll learn something today. For anybody who has thought about accessibility or considered like maybe looking at existing projects and auditing for accessibility, I think sometimes it can be really daunting and really hard, and it's just never going to be perfect. Every single person that's going to look at your website is going to have a different interpretation of what is and isn't accessible, and so it's by no means like a perfect outcome that you can ever achieve, right? So it's always about iterating and understanding how people are actually using your products. Last year, I gave a talk on accessibility at Shift, and someone asked me from the audience what the return on investment for doing accessibility work is. And it reminded me how people used to ask me the same question when I first started building responsive websites. People would try to calculate or figure out what the extra charge was for doing a mobile website, or what the return on investment would be for making a website responsive instead of just doing a desktop website. And so I wanted to share some interesting statistics with you just to understand more of the audience that we're trying to serve. So I want to point out that 1 in 4 non-institutionalized US adults, so that's somebody that's not in a facility or something like that, reported a disability in 2016. That's over 61 million people. So remember, that's 25% of the population has some kind of disability. And this includes people with disabilities in hearing, so whether or not somebody is able to have full auditory range, cognition, so maybe things like flashing images and stuff give them a hard time concentrating, mobility, I might not have the use of my hands to use a mouse really easily, or a smartphone, so I might be using accessibility features on a smartphone to swipe, or I might be using my keyboard to navigate. And then vision, right? So there's people with low vision, there's people with color blindness, and those are things that we have to think about when designing and developing applications. And the prevalence of disability increases as people get older. So I think it's important to note that more and more older adults are also using the internet. So in the UK, and you've probably also noticed on Facebook, your parents joining, in recent years, the number of women aged 65 to 74 using the internet went from at least half to 75%, which is the largest jump in any age group. And in Canada, where I'm from, an estimated 81% of Canadians aged 65 to 74 are actively using the internet. What that means is accessibility is worth thinking about now as we build and scale these systems, right? Not only consider the laws and requirements put in place by government, but also consider that it's just a huge user base that will continue to grow over time, especially as like baby boomers and that kind of thing go and get older. And the products we build should just be usable and useful for everyone, period. Doesn't matter who they are and what they can do. So when most governments set rules for accessibility, they usually point to WCAG, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines published by the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. And the goal of WCAG is to provide a single shared standard for web accessibility. And this is why most accessibility requirements put forward by the government usually recommend some kind of WCAG specification. So WCAG, specifically WCAG 2.0, is considered the gold standard for accessibility. And this is the criteria that we're striving for at Shopify. So there's something inaccessible about how this animation is presented, and this is on Shopify's homepage. It doesn't actually entirely look like this, but I want to give you guys a second to look at this and try to guess, keep in your mind what you think is inaccessible about this. So for any auto-updating information, i.e. like a slideshow or a video or something like that that starts automatically, it should be and is presented in parallel with other content, i.e. the text beside it. There should be a mechanism for the user to pause, stop, or hide that content, right? And maybe you don't want a user to be able to hide that content, but In this case, that content or something moving like that might be distracting for somebody who has a cognition issue, right? So one of the things that we did and that our marketing team did when auditing was add a pause button for our video components. And it's very unobtrusive. You don't really see it. It's just off to the side. But if you were tabbing through this page or using accessibility features on a computer, you would have the option to pause this video, right? And so we use this pause button now for our videos, whether they're full background images that have text on top of them, which we try not to use that much, or for examples of like the UI and demos like this that appear on some of our marketing pages. Another thing that we use are area attributes on that pause button. So you'll often, if not already, hear and see the acronym AREA as you learn more about web accessibility, and why AREA stands for the Web Accessibility Initiative, Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And again, it's a specification published by the W3C, so you know it's legit. But it's on how to increase the accessibility of web pages, more specifically dynamic content. So basically, that specification is comprised of area roles, states, and properties that are to assistive technology as CSS is to HTML. So for screen reader users, AREA dictates the rendering of the non-visual experience. So if I can't see anything on my page or on a screen, the AREA roles are what are reading out loud to me different things that are happening. So incorrect AREA might misrepresent visual experiences, so it's really important to understand fully how an AREA role or state works before putting them in your markup. So in the few code examples that I go into in this talk, I mention AREA attributes, and they look like this. They usually start with the word AREA. If you start and are curious, you can start inspecting websites and see that these things do exist. This one is specifically followed by something called live. The AREA attribute is then set to equal a value. In this case, it's set to polite. And this example is placing an AREA live attribute on the opening HTML div tag, indicates that the content that's inside, which is really hard to see now that I'm up here because of the lights, that might change. And if it does change in the future, to like tell somebody, tell the person who is using a screen reader. So ideally, if there's a success message that just appears on the page, you want a screen reader to let a person know that whatever the form that they sent or something that they just completed that thing was successful. And so somebody who's using a screen reader should have the same opportunity to understand that what they just did was successful as somebody who's not. So like I said, our marketing development team updated the video component in our design system, as well as other examples like this UI demo with AREA attributes. And so the one attribute that they use, among others, is AREA press. So we can use AREA to help us work with screen readers. In this case, an AREA attribute called AREA press tells the screen reader that an element's visibility can be activated together with its current state. So in practice, it looks like this. You set the button with the AREA press attribute equal to false, assuming that your video is like automatically playing or something like that to begin. And then AREA press value is then changed using JavaScript when selected. So to pause the video, you would set the AREA press to equal true because you clicked on the pause button. That makes sense, everybody? And the screen readers would announce the change, which is really awesome because most other changes to an element aren't usually detected by screen readers. So subsequently, they're not read out loud. And using our component library in our marketing design system at Shopify, we can easily implement these video components into Rails projects. It's as simple as doing an import of the necessary JavaScript and then initializing the component itself. And then we have a super simple way of adding the necessary markup for that component in a Vue ERB file wherever you want that component to appear, right? So in this case, we're referencing the actual video and then specifying a fallback image. So what happens if JavaScript doesn't exist or they have a shitty connection? Sorry, they have a bad connection. Then you have a fallback image to render in case your video actually doesn't load, right? You can add classes, you can set the autoplay to true or false, we can set a skin, which we've defined in our styles, and then a position, right? And these things are all based out of, all of these options are based out of things that we recognize that that component specifically might need. So right now, when we create net new components as part of our design systems at Shopify, we ensure that accessibility is considered from the start. That being said, we've existed as a company for a long time before we started doing a lot of accessibility work. So there's a bunch of stuff that needs to be updated and maintained and changed over time. So how do we do that at Shopify? How do we take existing systems that we have and maintain them properly? How do we iterate on existing components and build new ones the right way without having that system break down? So I've seen this happen and sort of systems fail before, where an application is made and then a design system based on the application is also created. Usually this is for client work because you're asked to do both. And then what happens is this flow continues, right? So there's design and development, the application's updated, we update the design system, which seems fine, but it's really easy for this kind of flow to enter into a place where the design system just doesn't get updated, right? Because the design system is the last thing in this chain to get updated, it becomes also the easiest thing to cut when you get busy, right? Or you don't have budget, or they didn't pay for those hours, right? So we're just not gonna update that design system when we add this feature. So rather than thinking of final applications as our sole responsibility, we have to recognize that a design system is what underpins our final products and pattern libraries, right? So we have to intentionally add a bit of friction to this process. And so by putting the system first, we create some necessary friction in the process. So at Shopify, when we, before somebody can merge a pull request that has maybe a change to an existing component, they first have to go to the repository for our component library and update that component. And then after that's approved and thinking about how does that component, how does my change affect the whole system, right? Because my component is being used, or this component could be being used in 62 other places. So if I'm gonna make a change here, because I need it on the page that I'm working on, how does that affect all of these other applications? So once thinking about that larger ecosystem, why it's necessary, is it necessary to even update that component? And then all of that is approved. Then, and only then, can that developer go back to their original PR and add to it an update for the new version of the Ruby gem, and then pull in the changes that they've made, right? And then that's part of their PR. So there's this bit of friction that sometimes, yes, causes a PR to stay open for a little bit longer, but it also ensures that our systems stay up to date and that the documentation is up to date as well, right? Everybody who's reviewing those PRs on the design system doesn't let anything through that feels like a one-off, right? We're all sort of taking care of this thing together. So a system should also not be a policing tool. While it needs to ensure that the highest standards of quality and accessibility empower developers, it should also create an environment where anybody can contribute to it easily. Right? So there's a great article that discusses this idea from a guy named Arda. I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name, from booking.com. And he says that by having well-defined processes and guidelines for contribution, we make sure that the extensive work being done by our product teams is fed back into the system when possible. And that's why documentation is so important, right? It's important to document new principles along the way, and the process is iterative and ongoing. It doesn't just stop when you made your design system and hand it off to your client. You have to, depending on if you're working as a consultant or you're on the embedded team, you have to hand it off in such a way that people understand and know how to actually update that design system after. So your system should really never be finished, right? Because the products change over time, and so do the contexts in which your system is used, right? So you might have created it for one website or application, but then maybe that company spins up like a sister or like a sister company or like something that falls underneath, and they want to use that same design system, but tweak it just a little bit. So there needs to be documentation that reflects that, and maybe your design system has to change because of things like that that come up. as much time and energy go into the why of your system as the implementation itself, right? So for example, in the documentation for our components in Polaris, we have recently added the addition of accessibility sections of various components. So for keyboard support, we kind of give a better understanding of how checkboxes might be used. And to interact with a checkbox, it's not super obvious to those who've never tried to fill out a form with a keyboard before, but you actually can't hit the enter button to select a checkbox. And so what I often see is people like are accessibility testing, and then they think their thing is broken. When it's not, you have to use the space bar to check off a checkbox. And this is what's known as focus management. And that's when somebody's navigating with the tab key, we have to preserve the meaning and operability of that content. So it's important to remember that not everybody uses a mouse to navigate online, and people use maybe a braille display or a pure keyboard, might not actually have the fine motor skills to use a mouse. So this was our hover state for links on the main Shopify website in like body sections. And as you can see, it's like slightly darker, but it looks almost the same as the regular link state. And the problem here is that it relies on color alone to convey meaning, right? We shouldn't be doing that. We should ensure that color alone is not the only means of conveying information. So this is actually a really simple fix, right? We just remove the underline in CSS. It's not hard. And we also wanted to make a more obvious focus state. And so these small tweaks make the website itself or the applications much more accessible at a large scale. I think when working with clients, it's and other teams, it's really important to create empathy around the systems that you create. And fostering empathy across those teams will help ensure that how the systems are used, and help ensure that the systems that are used are being used properly, right? So I've seen systems fail in the past when empathy and understanding wasn't communicated, say, to the internal development team that works for the company that you're handing it off to after you build the thing. Developers need to think about a culture of contribution, and actually creating one takes a lot of work, right? Decide together, create relationships where people feel valued, opinions are expressed and discussed. And Polaris is actually an open source repository, so we encourage the community and our own developers to take on accessibility work by using appropriate labels on actual issues like good first issue or distinguishing between design and development work. So let's talk really quickly about some not so secret benefits of building systems. Our third-party developers use our design systems to make their lives easier, right? Then makes their development faster, they can copy and paste things, and whether or not they know it, they get to consume all of that accessibility work that we're doing, right? So our React components are accessible, and because they're consumed by our app developers, they take full advantage of that abstraction. It enables us to be more considerate about the systems and how people consume the content by abstracting away that complexity. So we have skeleton pages that are used in our product before things are loaded on a page, almost as like a loading screen. And there's like a subtle animation where it just sort of gives a sense of like what will the screen look like. And we realized, though, in high contrast mode on Windows, which is an option that you can turn on for people with low vision, the skeleton doesn't render properly, / at all. The contrast isn't set. So when a page is loading content, this appears. And the necessary change, again, is really straightforward. It's just adding a media query for MS high contrast. We set the value to active, and this indicates that CSS that follows will be applied when a user sets their system to high contrast mode with any type of color variation on their system. And then this is what it actually looks like in high contrast mode. And you'll notice that there's like this small animation. This only shows up for a few seconds right before the actual application loads up, but it makes a huge difference in perceived performance. And Harry Roberts is going to be talking about performance stuff today, so I really encourage you guys to check that out. It's just as important to make the system that you create accessible too. This was a quick app that we made called Shopify Liquid Code Examples, which are built with Liquid, which is the templating language, and they're fully accessible, all the code examples. But we weren't able to make this a React library or something of components because the way that this templating language works, we want to be able to give the option for our theme developers to copy and paste the Liquid examples directly into their themes, and It doesn't matter what theme they're using or what CSS is already there. It should be able to work. And so for each example, there's actually a code snippet. And on that code snippet, there's a click to copy button to try to make it easier for people to get the code itself. And so we use, like I mentioned before, Area Live to work with screen readers. And in this case, I told you about this earlier, we set Area Live on the button to be equal to polite. And what that does is it means that when something changes within that button, like the content itself, because we changed the word copy to copied, exclamation, when they hit the copy button, we don't want it to override other messages. So polite just means it'll wait for a second and then read it out after other messages are read. You can also tell it to just interrupt things. But, so this is what it looks like. I have the screen, I have VoiceOver on my Mac, and you can see when I hit copy, it reads out copied to a user who has a screen reader running. So when we're thinking about design systems, we need to when we're thinking about design systems, we need to understand our audience and who we're building for. Are they internal developers? Are they external developers? Or are they clients, right? What elements do I need to include in the system for it to be useful for the people using it? The first thing to do is create that shared vocabulary like I talked about so that everybody understands what you're talking about. Because if two people have a different understanding of what you're referring to as a component, maybe one is actually a Rails partial and the other is a React component, then you're kind of out of luck because those kind of conversations become really difficult. And a design system is useless if people don't have to care about it, right? We need to create empathy for systems we build so that people who are building them understand how they work and why they were implemented in a particular way. I think working with clients and other teams, it's really important to create empathy because people need to understand that the consistency of a UI can result in better conversions and better usability and higher trust in a product. And documentation is also part of that, but so is building a culture of contribution. So we need to create clear ways of contributing back to the system itself, and empowering everyone to participate is how you continue to iterate and make the systems better. We're able to scale them because we create processes and some necessary friction to ensure that they're kept up to date. And our applications that consume the design system consume them, right? Not the other way around. Thinking back to the first responsive projects I ever worked on and how we had to convince clients that responsive design would be the standard in the future, we were future-proofing our work. You wouldn't make a website that was desktop only today, right? And everybody expects it to be responsive and work everywhere. So it's no longer an addition, but it's a requirement. And my hope is that as time goes on, we start to think about accessibility as a requirement, not something to be considered at the end of a project or an add-on, but something that's part of the beginning, right? As we build a website or an application, we think about, is it accessible and how do we make it that way? Thank you.